There is a prayer you've never fully spoken out loud. Not because it wasn't important, but because you didn't know how to explain it. How do you put into words the ache you've carried for so long? How do you describe a burden that nobody seems to understand? You've smiled through it. You've hidden it. You've told you're fine when your heart was asking questions nobody could answer. And maybe that's why this message found you tonight. Because God is not speaking to the prayers everyone heard. He's speaking to the one you kept to yourself. The prayer whispered through tears. The prayer hidden behind forced smiles. The prayer you carried when nobody noticed your pain. And God wants you to know something before you go any further. Heaven heard every word of the prayer you never told anyone about. Nothing was missed. Nothing was ignored. And what God is about to reveal may change the way you see this season forever. Maybe the hardest part of this season has not been the struggle itself. Maybe the hardest part has been carrying it alone. Being surrounded by people, yet feeling unseen. Having conversations every day, yet never feeling truly understood. You tried to explain it at first. You tried to put your feelings into words. But the more you tried, the more it seemed like nobody really understood what was happening inside you. So eventually, you stopped talking about it, not because the pain disappeared, but because explaining it became exhausting. You learned how to carry it quietly. You learned how to smile when people asked if you were okay. You learned how to say, "I'm fine," even when your heart felt heavy. And little by little, the deepest parts of your struggle became hidden. There were nights when you sat alone with thoughts you couldn't share. Moments when tears filled your eyes for reasons you couldn't fully explain. Times when you wished someone would simply look at you and say, "I know you're hurting. I know you're carrying more than you let people see." But those words never came, and that loneliness created another kind of pain. Not the pain of being physically alone, the pain of feeling emotionally invisible, feeling like everyone sees your smile, but nobody sees your burden. Everyone sees your strength, but nobody sees how tired you really are. Everyone sees what you do, but nobody sees what you carry. And then there was the prayer, the one you never shared, the prayer buried deep inside your heart, the prayer that wasn't always spoken with words. Sometimes it was a sigh, sometimes it was a tear, sometimes it was simply staring at the ceiling late at night and wondering if God understood what you couldn't explain. Because there are struggles that go beyond language, wounds that are difficult to describe, questions that are too personal to share. And perhaps that's where you've been living lately, caught between faith and exhaustion, hope and disappointment, believing God is there, yet wondering if anyone truly understands what you're going through. But here's what you need to hear tonight. The prayer you never explained to people did not remain hidden from God. The burden you carried in silence was never invisible to Him. And while others may have misunderstood your heart, heaven never did. In fact, God has been paying attention to every detail of the story you've been afraid to tell. And what He sees is far more important than what anyone else understands. And that is what God wants you to understand right now. You have never had to explain yourself perfectly for Him to understand you completely. People may only hear your words. God hears your heart. People may see the version of you that you show the world. God sees the part of you that nobody else ever sees. He sees the tears you wiped away before anyone noticed. He sees the disappointment you buried beneath your responsibilities. He sees the questions you've been carrying, the fears you've been hiding, the exhaustion you've been trying to push through. Nothing about your struggle has been hidden from Him. Not one moment, not one tear, not one sleepless night. There were nights when you felt completely alone. Nights when the room was quiet, but your mind refused to rest. You replayed conversations. You worried about the future. You wondered how much longer you could keep carrying what was weighing on your heart. And in those moments, it may have felt like nobody knew, nobody saw, nobody understood, but God was there, right there, not watching from a distance, not waiting for you to become stronger, not waiting for you to figure everything out. He was present in the middle of your confusion, present in the middle of your pain, present in the middle of your silent prayers, even when you couldn't feel Him, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. His presence never left you. The silence was not proof of His absence. The waiting was not proof of His indifference, and your unanswered questions were not proof that He stopped caring. Sometimes God's greatest work happens in places we cannot immediately see. While you were wondering if heaven heard you, heaven was already responding. While you were struggling to find the right words, God already understood the meaning behind them, because He does not listen the way people listen. He listens beyond the words, beyond the tears, beyond the silence, straight into the deepest places of your heart. And here's what you've been missing. The prayer you thought was hidden has been resting in God's hands this entire time. The burden you thought nobody understood has never left His attention. And the answer may be closer than you realize. Because God is not only aware of your silent prayer, He is already moving within the story connected to it. And before you see the answer, you need to understand the battle that has been trying to convince you otherwise. One of the greatest battles you've faced in this season has not been around you. It has been within you. Because when prayers go unanswered for a long time, doubt begins to whisper, quietly at first, almost unnoticed. It asks questions you never wanted to ask. What if nothing changes? What if I'm waiting for something that will never happen? What if God hears everyone else but not me? You may never have spoken those words aloud, but you've felt them. You felt them during the long nights, during the disappointing days, during the moments when hope felt harder to hold on to than fear. And that battle has been exhausting, not because you stopped believing in God, but because you became tired of carrying expectations that seemed to lead nowhere. Every delay felt personal. Every closed door felt significant. Every silence felt like another reason to lower your hopes. So little by little, you began protecting your heart. You stopped expecting too much. You stopped talking about the prayer. You stopped imagining what life might look like if the answer actually came. It felt safer that way, safer to expect nothing than to risk disappointment again. But here's what the enemy of your peace has been trying to do all along. Not just make you doubt the answer, make you doubt that God heard the prayer at all. Because if He can convince you that heaven is silent, He can make you stop listening. If He can convince you that God is distant, He can make you stop expecting. And if He can convince you that your prayer doesn't matter, He can make you surrender the very hope that has carried you this far. But none of those things are true. The fact that you are still here, still seeking, still believing, still listening, is proof that God has not abandoned your story. In fact, the battle itself reveals something important. People rarely fight for things they no longer care about. And the reason this struggle has felt so intense is because the prayer buried in your heart still matters. The dream still matters. The healing still matters. The breakthrough still matters. God has not forgotten it, and neither should you. Because while doubt has been trying to convince you that heaven is silent, God has been preparing to remind you that He heard every word, and what happens next may restore more than your hope. It may restore the part of your heart that stopped believing. Your silent prayer could ever be answered. And this is the moment where your perspective begins to change. Not because you suddenly have all the answers, not because every question has been resolved, but because you are starting to realize something powerful. The silence was never proof that God wasn't listening. It was only proof that His timing was different from yours. For so long, you've been measuring God's activity by what you could see, the open doors, the visible changes, the immediate answers. But God often works in ways that cannot be measured by human eyes. While you were waiting for evidence, He was working behind the scenes. While you were wondering if your prayer mattered, He was weaving together details you could not see. While you were fighting discouragement, He was preparing the next chapter of your story. And that changes everything. Because if God heard your silent prayer, then your waiting has purpose. If God heard your tears, then your pain has not been wasted. If God heard the cry you never shared with anyone, then your story is still moving forward. Think about that for a moment. The very thing you've been carrying in secret has been known by heaven all along, not partially known, completely known. Every fear attached to it, every hope attached to it, every emotion connected to it. God understands it all. And perhaps that is why you found this message today. Not by accident, but as a reminder that your faith should not be built on what you currently see. It should be built on who God is. A God who listens, a God who cares, a God who never ignores the cries of His children. And here's what you've been missing. Sometimes the answer begins long before the answer becomes visible. Sometimes God is already moving while everything appears unchanged. Sometimes heaven is working in silence before heaven speaks in clarity. So don't mistake stillness for inactivity. Don't mistake waiting for abandonment. And don't mistake delay for rejection. Because the prayer you've been carrying is not lost. It is not forgotten. And it is not beyond God's reach. In fact, this season may be preparing you to receive something greater than you expected. But before you can fully embrace what God is doing, you must remember who you are in His eyes. Because answered prayers are powerful, but a restored identity is what prepares you to walk confidently into the blessing when it arrives. For too long, you've allowed this season to tell you things about yourself, that were never true. The waiting told you that you were forgotten. The silence told you that you were overlooked. The delay told you that you didn't matter as much as others. And little by little, those messages began to settle into your heart. Not because you wanted to believe them, but because disappointment repeated them often enough. Yet tonight, God wants to break those lies, because your identity was never meant to be built on circumstances. It was never meant to be built on how quickly prayers are answered. And it was never meant to be built on the opinions of people who cannot see what God sees. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not overlooked. You are deeply known, deeply loved, and completely seen. Before anyone misunderstood your heart, God understood it. Before anyone overlooked your pain, God noticed it. Before anyone dismissed your struggle, God was already paying attention. Think about how comforting that is. The Creator of heaven and earth knows the details you cannot explain, the fears you hide, the questions you carry, the wounds you rarely talk about. Nothing about you is a mystery to Him, and yet He still loves you completely. Not a future version of you, not a stronger version of you, not a version that has all the answers. You, right now, in this moment, with all your questions, with all your imperfections, with all your uncertainty. That love has never changed, and neither has your value. Your worth is not determined by how people treat you. It is not determined by how successful you appear, and it is not determined by how long you've been waiting. Your value comes from the God who created you with purpose, the God who sees possibilities in you that you cannot yet see in yourself, the God who has carried you through every difficult chapter of your life. So stop measuring your future by your current season. Stop defining yourself by what has not happened yet. You are more than this waiting season, more than this struggle, more than this unanswered question. You are someone God still has plans for, someone God still speaks to, someone God still guides, and someone God still intends to bless. Because the prayer heaven heard was never connected to a forgotten person. It was connected to a beloved child whose story is far from over, and what God is preparing next will remind you just how closely He has been, listening all along. Now imagine the day when you finally look back on this season, the day when the prayer you've carried in silence begins to make sense, the day when you realize God was listening the entire time, not because everything happened exactly as you expected, but because His faithfulness became impossible to deny. The answer may arrive in a way you never imagined. A door opens, a burden lifts, a relationship heals, a new opportunity appears, or perhaps a deep peace settles into your heart where anxiety once lived. Whatever form it takes, this much is true. God does not hear prayers only to forget them, and He does not see tears only to ignore them. The prayer you've carried in secret is still in His hands. The story is still unfolding, and even now, heaven is moving in ways you cannot yet see. So hold on a little longer. Not because your struggle is greater than God's power, but because your breakthrough may be closer than you think. The prayer nobody else heard was heard by heaven, and the answer is already making its way toward your life. So tonight, rest in this truth. You never carried that prayer alone. God heard every whispered word. every silent tear, and every cry hidden deep within your heart. May peace replace your worry. May hope rise above your doubts. And may you find comfort in knowing that heaven has not forgotten you. The prayer nobody else knew about was never lost. God heard it. God remembers it. And in His perfect time, He will answer in a way that reminds you He was listening all along.